Alright, so it's been a while since I've done one of these videos. I just waited for new hardware, new GPUs. I've got a new test bench. I've got all the specs up on the screen right now. But today we are testing a Cyberpunk with the RTX 4060. The CPU I've got it paired with is an AMD Ryzen 5 5600 non-X. And we've got 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 MHz memory, CL18. Alright, let's just go over the settings here quickly. So we'll be starting at 1080p. And I'm going to start off on the Ultra preset, but I am going to disable any upscaling here. You can see that frame generation is not enabled, and then also crowd density is set to medium. All right, the reason for that is just the CPU seems to struggle a little bit. Don't compare this to my previous results where I tested the 3060 or any of my previous results actually, because that was done on an Intel 12400F CPU, and this is just a new test bench. I just wanted to test AMD, but these CPUs are pretty comparable, but there are still some differences. Alright, so I'm just going to keep this short. I think a lot of people actually misunderstand what my videos are all about. I just want to show you the performance of certain hardware in certain games. I'm not trying to be an influencer. Basically, I just wanted to show you that if you do have an RTX 4060 and you want to play Cyberpunk, for instance, then this is typically the performance you can expect. I'm going to shorten my benchmark runs a little bit. I'm just going to drive around in this area here, and I'm going to aim for 60 frames per second. So if a setting can't give me 60 frames per second, it's unfortunately not going to make it into this video. Alright, but there you see we had an average of around 80 frames per second with the 1080p Ultra, no upscaling, which is a pretty decent result. It's more or less on par with the 3060 as expected. Alright, so let's just see what happens if we enable a DLSS, and then we'll test with a frame generation as well. Alright, so we'll just start off with DLSS Super Resolution. Now this is more commonly referred to as a DLSS 2. This just upscales from a lower internal resolution to your native resolution of 1080p in this case, and frame generation is DLSS 3. NVIDIA launched the DLSS 3.5 yesterday, so that would be interesting to test as well, which basically improves the performance of ray tracing, or actually the accuracy of the rays. Alright, so you can see that we didn't gain much, right? Just reset our numbers there. We were sitting at around 80 frames per second average, and now with the DLSS quality, we're still getting 80 frames per second. And the issue is we are getting a little bit CPU bound here. You can see our GPU usage dipping there, going below 90%. It was 87% at a time there, and I still can't drive. But we are somewhat hitting a CPU limit here. It's not that bad, because we are still seeing slight increases in the frame rate, but just not as much as you'd expect by lowering the internal resolution by enabling DLSS quality, right? So that is actually where frame generation comes in handy. It can actually improve your frame rates even if you are CPU bound. Alright, so we had an average here of 85 frames per second, which is slightly higher than the previous run. I'm going to reload my saves after every run because I've seen some anomalies with this game, which is definitely not unheard of. Right, but let's see what frame generation can do here for us. So we're just going to use the exact same settings. I'm just going to enable DLSS frame generation. You'll see the DLSS super resolution goes to auto, just force it back down to quality. Now I usually disable these settings as well, but just for the sake of using presets, I'm just going to leave all of them enabled here. And you can see the frame time graph is a little bit thick at the start. That's just frame generation doing its thing. Let's just start our benchmark run here. And now you can see we're getting around 120 frames per second. I mean, which is pretty good. If you do have a 4060 GPU and you've got it paired with a high refresh rate monitor, then frame generation can definitely give you that high refresh rate experience in Cyberpunk at 1080p. Alright, there are a lot of negatives about the 4060. We'll talk about them a little bit later, but I'd rename the channel to mostly positive reviews because I just want to take a more positive outlook on the tech and the games, etc. There's a lot of negativity out there, and I'm not saying that it's not justified, especially when it comes to the 4060, but it does have some good points as well. Alright, so we had an average of 122 frames per second there. 1% lows were sitting at 89, and our 0.1% lows were actually pretty low at 58. I do think this might be CPU related because the lows were slightly higher on the 12400F, even though these CPUs are perform pretty much the same in Cyberpunk. I do think that it does struggle a little bit with the lows, or this specific system anyway. All right, now it's time to see how it does at ray tracing, right? So you just enable ray tracing there at the bottom, and we're going to enable all ray traced options, but we'll leave the lighting to medium. I mean, it is a 60 class GPU, or more often referred to as a 50 class GPU, but we'll disable frame generation. We'll just go with DLSS quality here, and the rest of the settings are still pretty much the same. So still on the ultra preset just now with the ray tracing enabled, and it looks like we might be getting almost 60 frames per second. It's going to dip in some other areas, definitely below 40 frames per second, even if we have a look there, the dip below 50. And this is one of the more intensive areas in the game. If you do have crowd density set to high, this actually becomes a very, very demanding area. On medium crowd density, it does become a lot more manageable, but you can see dropping in below 40 frames per second there, just driving through that tunnel there, and that's unfortunate. I mean, you pay $300 for this GPU, you'd expect it to do a little bit better at ray tracing. Obviously we're playing at ultra, and we can definitely improve that by probably going down to a lower detail setting. Now, I know I said that if we can't get 60 frames per second, it's not going to be in this video. I just wanted to show you what the performance is like with ray tracing before we start optimizing the settings. Right, so let's drop the preset down to medium once again with the DLSS set to quality, and we'll enable ray tracing once again, and medium lighting. Right, let's see if we can maintain 60 frames per second now. And it looks like we might, I mean, we're not going to maintain it, but we're around 5 to 10% faster than what we were at previously. The dips might not be as pronounced. I mean, we're staying close to that 60 frames per second. It's just my driving that needs a lot of improvement here, but this sits an area there, dropping down into the mid 40s once again. So definitely not a 60 frames per second locked experience at these settings. And this is where frame generation can actually help. If you've watched any of my previous videos, I do say that you need a pretty high base frame rate before you can enable frame generation. The reflections look pretty good. The reason for that is you don't want to have that much of an increase in input latency, and frame generation unfortunately does increase input latency. But the higher your base frame rate before you enable frame generation, the less noticeable it becomes. Alright, so we're sitting at 60 frames per second, but it wasn't constant. So let's just use these exact same settings, and we'll enable DLSS frame generation. Just make sure that we keep DLSS set to quality there. Right, and now we are almost at 100 frames per second. Let's see how well it maintains it. I mean, our aim here is for 60 frames per second. The input latency feels pretty okay. I did test it extensively last night before I recorded this video, and in this specific area, dropping into 65. Alright, so it managed to stay above 60 frames per second. That big blip there was just the game auto-saving, so it messed up our lows a little bit, but you get the idea, right? It is a little bit stuttery here and there, but all in all, if you want ray tracing enabled at 1080p, unfortunately you're going to have to use either a more aggressive DLSS upscaler setting or frame generation. Alright, now it's time to move on to 1440p. Alright, we're now at 1440p. We're going to test on the medium preset, no DLSS frame generation and no ray tracing. We'll just disable DLSS or AMD FSR. I don't know why that gets applied by default, even if you do have an NVIDIA GPU. Anyway, so we'll run it native first. Let's just start our benchmark run here. That's the wrong button, and there we go. Alright, so I mean, the game looks pretty sharp at 1440p. This is a pretty good looking game even on the medium preset, but we are failing to hit that 60 frames per second target, right? So I'm not going to be testing too much here. Once we start driving around, it'll drop down even more. So 1440p native, unfortunately not the way to go. So I think we'll have to enable some DLSS here. So let's just go with the DLSS quality. I think that should be enough to get us to 60 frames per second. Let's just reset our numbers. And that's a pretty nice bump in performance there. We've got sitting at around 80 frames per second. Now let's just drive around a bit. Let's see if it maintains 60 frames per second going under this bridge on the return path. But so far this is pretty good. I mean, sure, we're not rendering at 1440p. We are rendering at a slightly lower resolution. I'll put up the resolution chart right now because I just can't remember it. But we maintained 70 frames per second going past that specific spot there, which I didn't expect. I thought we were going down below 60, but this wasn't terrible. So 1440p on the medium preset with the DLSS set to quality will get you a pretty decent frame rate. Now, the positive that I want to talk about this GPU is just look at the power consumption. We are sitting at around 110 watts. I mean, that is pretty good. We got the same performance as a 3060, give or take, and using around 2/3 of the power. The 3060 that I had topped out at around 180 watts, and I saw this one go as high as around 121. So it's pretty impressive for the amount of power it uses. Alright, so that's it for 1440p without ray tracing. Let's see if we can actually do some ray tracing here as well. I'm going to, before we do that, let's just run with the frame generation just in case you want a little bit of a higher frame rate, right? So yeah, let's just set to quality, no ray tracing, and frame generation is enabled. Let's just reset our numbers here, and we gained around 20 to 30 frames per second here, which is nothing to scoff at. It's not going to give you a constant 120 frames per second, but if you do have a 120 or 144 hertz monitor, this will definitely be noticeable. I mean, sure, these are fake frames or AI generated frames which are inserted between game engine generated frames, but really I've been using it for quite a while, this tech on my 4080, and I think it's pretty great. If you're not that sensitive to input latency, it's definitely worth it. And once again, if your base frame rate is high enough, you're not going to really notice the slightly higher input latency. As I showed you in my previous video, the average I've seen across my testing was around 10 millisecond increase in input latency, and that's 1/100th of a second. That's pretty low. Alright, so had an average of around 108 frames per second. Our lows weren't too terrible, and our 0.1% lows weren't too bad either. So frame generation also helps when you are slightly CPU bound. Not that we were at 1440p. Sorry, I'm just jumping up and down here while I'm all waffling about. Alright, let's start testing ray tracing. Right, so I'm just going to leave the exact same settings, so it's 1440p medium, no frame generation though, and we'll enable ray tracing here at the bottom. And once again, we'll enable all aspects of ray tracing. Obviously, you can pick and choose between these. They do offer some performance improvements if you disable some of them, especially reflections. That's a big performance hog, but just want to test everything here. So 1440p on the medium preset, DLSS set to quality, and ray tracing enabled. And off we go. No. All right, we are literally getting around 1/3 of our previous frame rate with the ray tracing enabled. This is this is a pretty bad experience. I mean, sure, if you're targeting 30 frames per second, which in all honesty you really shouldn't. I mean, at these lower frame rates, the motion blur is really terrible, but getting 25 frames per second, not going to work. All right, let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. All right, so I just reloaded my save just to see if that helps. And this is now with the DLSS set to performance. I mean, the game still looks pretty okay at 1440p, but getting almost 60 frames per second. Let me just show you the settings here. So we're on DLSS performance, right? That's pretty much the setting we have to use to get close to 60 frames per second. But that's okay because we can actually then enable frame generation to get slightly higher than 60 frames per second. As mentioned in all my previous videos, the target with the DLSS frame generation should not be 60 frames per second. You're going to have a terrible experience. If you go from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second, you're not going to see only a 10 millisecond increase in input latency. You're going to see around 100 milliseconds. And even people who are not sensitive to input latency definitely is going to feel that. All right, so I mean, we're getting around 50, which I'd say is around the minimum you'd need to enable frame generation. So let's see if we can get a decent consistent frame rate here with frame generation enabled. Still DLSS performance, just forcing that on. And once again, you can see DLSS frame generation doing its thing there with the frame time graph. And we went from 55 to around 80 frames per second, and I move the mouse, so it's definitely quite a big improvement here. Now I know there's a lot of talk around the 4060, and I chimed in as well. The 4060 costs around the same as the 3060. It's got less VRAM, it's only got 8 PCIe lanes, it's only got a 128-bit bus, and it's terrible. Sometimes it even loses to the 3060 when it comes to raw performance, right? But it's got DLSS 3 frame generation, and that's what NVIDIA relies on to sell these GPUs. Once again, I'm not saying you should buy one of these. In fact, there are a lot of other GPUs if you want to go second hand. I'd strongly advise you not to buy the 4060, but if there's no other option and you want DLSS and frame generation, that kind of stuff, you've already got a 4060, this is the type of performance you can expect, right? And frame generation with these settings seem to be okay. I mean, driving around, the performance was pretty good and the input latency wasn't bad, and the same on foot using a gun. Sure, you have to run at performance mode DLSS at 1440p, which is definitely not ideal. So if you want to use ray tracing, unfortunately a 60 class GPU is not going to give it to you. I mean, just look at that sign there, that Kabayan food sign. I mean, the quality, the detail is seriously lacking. Let's just move a little bit closer. There you go. So that's what it's supposed to look like. And I mean, we're playing on the medium preset with DLSS set to performance. It negates any visual improvements that you'd see by enabling ray tracing. Sure, the lighting is still accurate and the shadows, etc., but it does come at a huge cost, and it's a cost that is definitely not worth it in my opinion. All right, so that's it for 1440p. Now let's see what happens at 4K. Right, so we are now at 4K and we'll be testing on the low quick preset, except we won't be using FSR. We'll use DLSS. I think we'll have to start on performance right off the bat here, and maybe that's a little bit too aggressive because we're getting 80 frames per second. Let's see if we just go down to balanced here, and balance seemed to be pretty okay, getting 70 frames per second, which is pretty good in my opinion. All right, let's just reset our numbers here. Let's go look for my car, and 70 frames per second 4K. I mean, it's not true 4K, it's upscaled 4K. There's a difference, but this is not a terrible experience, and it is a very good looking one. I mean, there's a big difference between 1440p and 4K. Even on a 27-inch monitor that I'm sitting around, what's it, around 2 feet away from, that's 60 centimeters for those who use the correct system. And I mean, it's definitely not a terrible experience. I would play like this if I had a 4K monitor paired with this GPU, which I currently have, obviously, because I'm benchmarking it. But if this was my daily system, this is definitely not the worst experience I've had on this 4060. All right, so let's see if we can actually do some ray tracing at 4K as well. I highly doubt it. We probably won't see 60 frames per second, but we gotta try, right? So once again, just going to enable all the ray trace settings here, leave it on medium, but let's just bump this up to ultra performance. Right, still on the low preset, just with ultra performance, and ray tracing is now enabled. And I think, all right, let's just reset our numbers. and that's 50 frames per second. Now there you'll see you don't even have to look far. Just look at the shimmering, the lights there. Not even just the lights, just to the left of it you'll see the plants shimmering as well. That's just unfortunately how DLSS works. It needs to upscale from a very low internal resolution. In this case I think ultra performance is 1080p. I might be wrong. I don't have that chart in front of me at the moment. Alright, but getting 50 frames per second with ray tracing enabled. Now, I need to just say that apart from all the flickering issues, the detail and the crispness, they're actually not too bad. It's just the shimmering in the distance, the lights and the finer details that go missing. The game does look okay apart from that. So not something that I'd recommend you use. Ray tracing at 4K, definitely not the way to use this GPU, but yeah, to test it. And now let's see what happens once we enable frame generation. Stupid thing. All right, so ultra performance, all the settings are still the same. 4K low, ray tracing enabled, and we'll start our frame rate counter. Yeah, now this is something that I did see earlier as well, where frame generation does not really help a lot for this GPU at 4K, and I think it's because the GPU is so saturated at 4K. I think everything is just fully maxed out at 4K that frame generation is just not working as it should, or as it does at lower resolutions. I mean, I could be completely wrong. Maybe it's something else, the bus width or something. The game does feel very janky at the moment. Like, it's not input latency related, but there's a delay in the game. Like we crashed, and it took a few seconds for a few moments for the crash to register. Sometimes I can't turn. So this is a very janky experience, and one that I highly don't recommend. The input latency is definitely not terrible, but then again, you do negate the visual improvements of ray tracing if you play at these settings. So definitely not something that I would recommend, as I said. All right, so our last test would actually be RT path tracing or RT overdrive, but that we'll have to test at 1080p for obvious reasons. So let's see how it goes. Right, so we're at 1080p. I'm going to test this on the medium preset. I'm just going to disable frame generation for now, but we'll use DLSS. So let's go with balanced. I'm not sure exactly what settings to actually use, but I can't remember. I tested it, but anyway. So we don't need to enable any of those options, sorry. So you just enable path tracing, technology preview, and all the other ray traced options do disappear. Let's just enable that anyway as well. So 1080p on the medium preset, DLSS set to balanced, no frame generation, and path tracing is enabled. Right, I just reloaded my save here. All right, so let's just reset our numbers here, and getting around 40 frames per second. Now the game does look terrible. I mean, you can't see any of the finer detail in those aircon units there. This is definitely not the way to experience this game. Sure, the lighting will be spectacular and accurate, but this is definitely looking like a 2005 game. All right, so path tracing maybe not as viable. I mean, if we go down to, let's just go down to performance DLSS here, and didn't gain much, still 40, 45, well, now it's climbing. So 50 frames per second, give or take, around a 10% improvement there in performance. Ultra performance, now it just looks terrible, but we got 60 frames per second, and that's all that matters. I mean, I'm just kidding. This looks terrible. So let's just go down back to DLSS performance quickly. This was around 50 frames per second, right? And then we'll enable frame generation, which is at the top here. All right, so DLSS performance we said. All right, so DLSS performance with the frame generation, getting 80 frames per second, not the end of the world, but the game does look terrible. Definitely not the GPU to buy if you are interested in path tracing. But let's just drive around quickly, see if the performance holds up. I suspect we will maintain 60 frames per second in my short benchmark run if I can get around this traffic jam here. A lot of those trucks on here. And I mean, sure, we're getting 60 frames per second, but at what cost? The input latency definitely feels okay. I mean, I can drive, well, I mean, I can't drive, but I can drive as bad as I usually do. But maintaining that 60 frames per second, right? But our 0.1% lows are struggling quite a bit. It's around half of our average, which is not ideal to see, but that's just how it goes. But you can see the lighting is definitely very, very good. The visuals are extremely terrible. All right, but that's going to be it for this video. I just want to talk about one or two conclusions here. Firstly, I really don't think you should buy the 4060. Positives are the power usage. It's very, very efficient when it comes to watt per frame. Doing 100 watts, well, 110 watts in this scene with path tracing enabled. Ray tracing performance are not that good either, but then again, it is a 60 class GPU, or actually a 50 class GPU if you take the specs into consideration. It's only got 8 PCIe lanes, it's only 128-bit memory bus, only 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So if you can find a 3060 or even a 3060 Ti, which also has only 8 gigabytes of VRAM, you would be better off. Just you won't have DLSS frame generation or AV1 encoding. But I think at this price point, if this GPU falls below $250, it might be worth it, but currently it definitely is not. That's just my opinion, of course. All right, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.